Hey gang, it's me, the Inner Nerd, and in this video I'll be making Eduard's 132 scale Bf109. So stick around and join me whilst I build, paint and weather what is my first real attempt at a 132 scale kit. Let's go. So this project kinda took a bit longer than I anticipated, 6 months in fact. But I have been learning to ride a motorbike and it has been summer, so it's not been all sanding, filling and painting for the entire time. As I mentioned at the start of the video, this is a 132 scale kit from Eduard, and it's my first proper attempt, I would say, at making a kit of this scale. I did give the Bevel Tornado a go a few years back, but I don't think my skills were anything to do the kit justice. Hopefully they are now, or this video isn't going to be very interesting. Whilst I'm talking about the video itself, I'll be covering the build including some extra detail parts I'll be making myself. Then in the middle section I primer and paint the model using an airbrush, so I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Then to finish off I'll be weathering, and this time I'm only going to be using oil paints as I've seen a lot of comments recently about how to use oils when weathering. As with almost every aircraft kit ever created, the instructions start with the cockpit. Nothing really to report here, it builds up nicely. This kit's part of the Profi Pack range, so you get an additional photo etch with coloured brass. I find it best to cut on something solid. This is a slate coaster. And if you're new to photo etch or even modelling for that matter, I use VMS superglue for the non-plastic parts. This photo etch one gives just enough time to position the part before it sets. For the plastic parts I use AK's fast setting extra thin cement. This is just the same as Tamiya extra thin quick dry and is the king of glues for this type of modelling, so if you haven't already, get some. Also these tweezers are made by Mr. Hobby and they're called Mr. Bevel Tweezer MT204. I think these are discontinued though, so you might have a bit of a hard time finding them online. I wanted to make some small modifications to the cockpit and needed to drill out some small holes. For this I turned to my Proxxon Micromot. These are quite expensive but the best I've seen for accuracy. Just look at the smoothness in that drill bit there. As good as the tool was, I still made a bit of a hash of that, so I 3D printed a replacement part with the holes already in, then cut the head off the kit part and glued the pieces together. To add more details into the cockpit I used some copper wire of various thicknesses. I used 0.3mm mainly and fixed them in place one by one using VMS superglue. I printed some more modifications for what I assumed to be electrical boxes down in the footwell that weren't included in the kit. I drilled small holes in these to insert more wires that threaded along the cockpit walls. Then it was time for a channel first. I've never done an exposed engine before and the one in the kit looked nice, so I went ahead and started to remove most of the details to make my own. Starting with 1mm solder wire, I replaced the tube that ran along the side just above the ignition coils. All of this detail work was again carried out using VMS superglue. Another tube followed using the copper wire I used for the cockpit, slowly adding each detail in turn using the various wire thicknesses and copying my references. You'll notice I only did this on one side of the engine, and that's because mainly I couldn't be bothered with the other, but I do plan to feature this model in my first proper diorama, and the other half, conveniently, will be covered in a tarpaulin of some kind. Now that all the sub-assemblies are built, I moved on to primer. I'm using Mr. Surfacer Black, and that's mixed with Mr. Colour Leveling Thinner at around 50%. I spray this at 10 psi using a 0.15mm nozzle. Using a slightly lower air pressure this time of 10 psi, I use AK Real Colours RLM02 for the base colour of the cockpit and the other bits and pieces. So the airbrush setups I use are 12 psi for the primer, thin 50-50, then for the main paint it's 10 psi at around 40% thinner. If you are new to modelling and want to know a bit more about airbrushing, then I have a video that could be of interest. It's called Model Making for Beginners, and the video uses a nice air fixed Spitfire to demonstrate on. I've tried to include everything in that video, and the link is in the description below. Obviously finish this epic video first and then go and watch that. I find nice, natural chipping is one of the most difficult areas of weathering. To help me get this right, I use packing foam to gently apply metallic paint onto the most raised areas of the seat and footwell. The important part is not to have too much paint on the sponge, so you don't get blobs. That's not a medical term, but the less on the sponge the better. To add some depth to the cockpit I use 2 enamel washes. These won't damage the paint since that's acrylic lacquer, so the thinners in these won't take the paint with it when it comes to application. Next up was to lighten the raised details with Ammo's oil brusher colour buff. This was applied using a dry brush to pick out the most raised details which would appear like a highlight compared to the darker areas we just made with the washes. The same was done on the engine using neutral grey. The point of this technique is to firstly use the base colour as the main, then add darker and lighter tones to create more depth, or a perception of depth at least, giving more contrast between the tones used to create the effect. For better alignment, I always sand off the location pins moulded onto the wings. This gives more range of movement and to align the top and bottom sections since the pins are usually out. The build was relatively straightforward on this apart from the lower wing to fuselage section, which will need a bit of attention later on, but first I want to show you this. This fantastic creation is a model stand, designed and printed by me to help me, and you of course. It's available on my website theinnerNerd.com and it's been designed to keep the model stable when working on those masterpieces. All 3 heads are fully adjustable both in height and range, and the layout is also fully adjustable, meaning it'll hold anything from a 172 Spitfire, a 148 Jet, or even 132 models like this. In the box you get 3 heads shown in this video, as well as 1 more to help building with jet models more specifically. All of the details are on my website theinnerNerd.com, and there's a link in the description so you can head there with but a click of a button. With the main build complete, I started work on filling my crack. There was quite a gap between the air intake and lower wing, too much to tackle with filler, so I went rodding instead. Ooh. After that, the smaller gaps could be filled with my go-to filler, Perfect Plastic Putty. I applied this generously, then removed with the damp cotton bud to leave a neat finish. The sanding removes some of the panel lines from the plastic, so I put those back using the CMK razor saw I used before in the cockpit modifications. To highlight the rescribing, I used black enamel wash which would sink into the details. This way it's easier to see what needs to be worked on before I lay down any primer. Good job I did this because I'd forgotten the rivets. I added these back in with this pointy thing and also a rivet tool from SBS. Moving on to primer, I used Mr. Surfacer 1500 in black using the same 50-50 mix I did for the cockpit. Applying it nice and lightly on 12 psi, I used a wet coat to help the self-leveling thinner work its magic. As expected, the primer revealed some flaws in the build. The main one was this join, so I tackled that with a mix of scraping and sanding until I'd work it smooth enough for re-primer and paint. I'd had the idea of pre-weathering this model using a textured base coat. I've done something similar before on my SU-22 fitter build and that came out nice. I used heavily thinned, like 70% thinner, white paint and applied it in the boundaries of each panel line. The uneven nature of this base coat will cause the overlying paint to have various tones as the primer seeps through. It turns out that this method was a little wasted on this particular model because of how I weathered it later on. But if you're going for an almost factory fresh look, this is a good technique to get a slight bit of discoloration in the main paint scheme. I've been asked in the past to show masking in a bit more detail, so here it goes. I only use Tamiya masking tape and you can get that in various widths. I tend to use 20 and 6mm. To get nice square ends, I cut it on a marked cutting mat and use the lines as a guide. When putting it onto the model, I try and keep it to one piece if possible. This is more important on camouflage schemes or where two colours meet because several pieces may not always align perfectly straight. But for something like this engine, several parts might be necessary to get all the parts masked sufficiently. There's not really much else to say, but a top tip would be always to use a sharp blade. A blunt blade will almost certainly tear the tape and you'll get a rough edge. To start the painting, I begin with the lightest colour, if not that, the area which is easiest to mask. On this model the first was both of these, the white on the wingtips. In order not to destroy the base colour work, I apply this in thin layers, taking note of the coverage after each pass so that the mottled effect could be just about visible after the final coat. Next up was the underside colour of RLM65. This was the second lightest colour on the model and I needed this to grow up the fuselage to blend in the top colours of the camouflage properly. For the camouflage pattern, I lightly marked out the separation lines in real time. I'd masked beyond this point anyway, so if I went a little further than needed, it will easily be covered up. To reduce the checkerboard effect of the base coat, I filled in the camouflage area more randomly after the first few coats. This broke up the black line and therefore the grid pattern underneath. The final colour of the scheme was RLM71. This is quite a bit darker than the other colours used, so I had to be careful not to lay this on too thick or the base coat will be invisible. I freehanded the mottle effect on the sides of the fuselage. By being random with the airbrush and consistent on the trigger, the colour can be built up in levels, making some appear bolder than others, making for the faded effect. Metallic colours are best over a gloss black base coat, so here I use Mr Colour GX2 followed by AK's Extreme Metal Steel. I've seen pictures of these exhausts fully encrusted in rust, but that was a bit too excessive for me, but to add the burnished effect onto the stacks, I dry brushed Citadel Rune Lord brass onto the most raised areas of the exhaust. The main painting was now complete and time to add the decals, but instead of using the decals for the insignias I wanted to paint them. To do this I created my own masking set using the kit decals as a template. Designed on the computer and cut on my silhouette machine, these will be ready to apply straight onto the model. Working out which mask was applied first was way more tricky than I had imagined, but after I got the order correct they were simple enough to do. To remove any rough edges I carefully went over each insignia with 3000 grit sanding sponge which levelled out any raised spots. Moving on to the decals, I tried something crazy. I got a lot of comments saying that the gloss coat is unnecessary and only adds time and layers to the build. With no further explanation I didn't really understand why. But looking at the finish from the AK real colour paints you can see that they're very smooth and also a bit glossy. Well, more satin, but good enough to lay decals on. So with no gloss coat at all, I applied the decals with Mark Set Strong from Tamiya. And you know what? It worked. There were still the raised edges from the larger decals, but removing the gloss coat wouldn't help with this anyway. The best way to get rid of this witness is to gently sand it away with 3000 grit sanding sponge. I'd say one of the biggest mistakes I made with this build was leaving the canopy off. I'd done this in the effort to reduce the amount of paint applied to it and therefore the thickness build up against the tape, but as it turned out the fit wasn't all that when I come to fit it at this stage. I had to do some careful filling and sanding to get the part aligned with the fuselage, and it would have been better just to apply the canopy at the building stage. But anyway, painting done and now it's time for my favourite bit, the art, weathering. And I'm going to be doing that exclusively with enamel washes and oil paints, so if you're new to oils or want to know more, this could be a good bit to stick around for. The first thing to note is that I'll be using one type of thinner throughout this entire process, and that's called white spirit, or you could use turpentine as well, they do the same thing. Also spot at the bottom of the screen is a note of what I'm using at that point as I flip back and to from wash or oil to thinner regularly. So what started with here is Ammo's neutral wash, and that's put straight over the paint which has a matte to satin finish. As mentioned before, the paint is acrylic lacquer base, so anything oil base I put over the top won't affect it. Also the kind of matte satin finish helps with the oil grip a little more than it would on a gloss finish, and that's helping me keep it in the areas I want without it running away. Once the oil wash was dry to the touch I got back over the area again, but this time the brush now only contains thinner. With the brush only dampened with thinner I can agitate the oil and manipulate where it's concentrated. I pushed the body of the wash into the panel lines as this where I saw it on the references. The references, by the way, are linked in the description below, where I have them saved to a Pinterest board. For the white area I used a different colour which was more grey than the beige of the neutral wash, so that it didn't look too dusty. I did the same technique in this area, waiting for the oil to dry, then agitating into position with white spirit and a brush. I think the blue dirt wash was a bit too dark for this white, so I softened the effect further with a dry cotton bud. No thinners were needed here, as the cotton bud could take off the excess oil since it wasn't fully dry, but only dry to the touch. Up next was something I wanted to create for a while but not really known how. When I was looking at references, not only for this model but for almost all of them actually, they have a grittiness to them which I could never capture. It's a small but noticeable grain to their texture as the weather and use tints the paint in different ways. To replicate this, I mix a colour similar but not exactly the same as the area I want to affect using oil paints. Then applied with some packing foam, I dabbed the colour onto the model. Since the two colours of this scheme are different, I masked off each area as I worked to contain it. I was careful not to apply too much since when it came to blending it I didn't want to repaint the entire area, but to leave behind the grittiness I was talking about. When it came to blending the oil layer into the main paint, I used a small amount of enamel thinner just like I did in the previous technique. This time I kept the oil within the boundaries of each panel, breaking up and dissipating the oil ready for the next step. Once that had dried out, which didn't take long since I used very little thinner, I went back over the area with a clean sponge this time and just softened the choppiness of the oil blooms because it looked too raw straight from the previous step. This was a technique I wasn't quite used to at this point, but as the video goes on the process gets a bit more fluid. With the top surface camouflage gritted, I'm going to call it, I picked out some staining using Ammo's engine grime wash. And although it says engine on it, you can use it elsewhere, and I thought a good colour to contrast against the RLMO2 areas on the wing. I applied the wash in segments and left to go touch dry. After a few minutes it was ready to blend with some white spirit enamel thinner. Doing this live on the model rather than a complete wash picks out areas more effectively than just covering the entire model the same colour wash. Full washes can be useful but tend to dye the model a different colour, whereas doing it this way allows you to really concentrate on the area at a time. Calling this part of the weathering complete, I hope you can see the grittiness that I keep banging on about. The colour of the camouflage is now broken up into lots of various shades within each section. Now it's time to add more detail weathering and deepen that effect now that we have a roadmap to follow from this stage. But first we need to save as. To do this I seal the oils in with VMS satin varnish so that any further oil work we do won't be affected because it's sealed in with a layer of acrylic clear. The satin clear coat was applied very thin just to cover the oil work I'd done, so about 30 minutes later I could carry on working. First I added some stain spots using AK Real Colours 6RP Black, which was heavily thin with their own branded thinner. And I used the same mix to apply the exhaust soot trails. To get a feathered effect I started the streak close up to the model to get a more concentrated spray pattern. Then the further away from the front I got, I pulled back away from the model to soften the density of the spray. I noticed on one of my reference photos in particular that the area where the pilot accesses the cockpit got very mucked up. To deepen the weathering already there, I applied spots of Ammo's oil brush Starsuit filth to that area. To blend this in, I used enamel thinner again directly on the model to dissipate the oils and make it bloom. I moved the resulting mix around to get rid of any hot spots from what I applied straight from the oil brusher. Since I covered quite a large area with a high contrast colour, it took more than one pass to get it to look right, so I let it dry in between and went at it again with some fresh thinners. Next I added some streaks using raw oil paints. I started the streak using a flat brush which was dampened with enamel thinner and carefully dragged the oil spot in the direction of airflow. With the top side done, I flipped the model over and adjusted the model stand to suit, then went to work using the same techniques and methods as I did up top. To get a larger area of staining, I laid down a base coat of a more yellow-brown version of the RLM65 blue made from oil paint. I applied this in the same way as the grittiness and blended with a dry sponge ready for the following effect. After sealing that in with a layer of VMS matte clear varnish, or the save as button as I like to call it, I laid down an area of pure enamel thinner, nothing else mixed in. Whilst the layer of thinners was still active, I added spots of Ammo's fresh engine oil wash and blended that in live on the model, similar to what I did on the cockpit access area on the wing above. Again, because this was a high contrast, I had to do it in several passes to get it blended sufficiently and not look like a big oily blob. No one wants a big oily blob, especially on the bottom. More washes of different colours were then applied in various spots underneath to add the overall effect of use and dirtiness. More concentrated areas of fresh engine oil were then applied along panel lines to show more recent leaks and spills. Spatters were also added by flicking it off a paintbrush using a toothpick. I added some more extra thinner to this so that the splats wouldn't be too intense in colour. Okay, so that's all the oil weathering done. I almost managed to make 100% oil weathering, but I do need some dust. Here I use VMS European Brown Earth pigment to apply the dried mud onto the wheel arches and tyres. I don't use any pigment fixer for this because the matte finish helps the pigment grip. With all of the weathering now finished, I move on to the final assembly. I use various VMS superglues for this, but the most common was extra thin. For the open canopy I use resin superglue, and although this isn't resin, the consistency was good for me to safely apply the clear part and position it before it went dry. The last thing to fit into position was the antenna. I used some old fishing line I found in the shed for this. Not sure what weight it is, but the thickness looked about right for the model scale. I fixed this in place with extra thin superglue and used CA accelerator spray so I didn't have to hold my hand steady for too long. And that's it, gang, we've made it to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video and learnt something from it maybe. You'll be seeing this model again sometime in the future as I want to make a smallish diorama with this as the centrepiece. You can see some of my inspiration for that project using the link to my Pinterest board in the description below. This link also contains reference images I used to make this model. Otherwise, enjoy the presentation. I'm the Inner Nerd and this was Eduard's 132 scale Messerschmitt Bf109E-3. Also a big thank you to my Patreon family. If you are one, you'll see your name here. If you're not, then there's a link in the description below. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and I think there's even a tip button now along there somewhere. Anyway, hit all the buttons of that nature. Don't forget, if you want a model stand featured in the video, visit my website, theinnernerd.com. And thanks, I'll see you in the next one where I build a P51 Mustang. Ooh.